talking about how we react to things. Transitioning to our next topic, in leading into this, I must admit, I was kind of hesitant speaking about this topic, Dr. Rod. Shared it with you and got your advice as we spoke about. We get advice and we said, yeah, let's talk about this because it is a very touchy subject, and I don't want to get on my soapbox about it, but I also don't want to skirt the actual conversation. This is something that's a little bit closer to Dr. Rod, a little bit closer to home, is the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras that was on this weekend in Australia. And the news is blowing up about a couple of key things. One of those is the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was the first ever sitting Prime Minister to actually attend and walk in the parade in support of this parade. Now, I actually feel like from a political, talking about political leadership, this is a very obviously the gay and lesbian or the LGBT whatever pluses and minuses and divides and everything else that they want to add on. It's a very hot political topic. But I do kind of want to touch it kind of almost from a ministry standpoint, I suppose, especially having someone like yourself, Dr. Rod, as a pastor. How do we, when you see something like this, the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras they talk about it being celebrating diversity, but if you look at it, it's just literally celebrating vulgarity. It's people jumping around half naked in bondage gear, it's just half nude and all that sort of, it's very over sexualized. And I don't know how do we as ministry leaders respond to something like this? Because yes, Jesus has called us to love everyone, and we love the person, we hate the sin, like that sort of thing. Like I've actually been in business with a number of homosexuals and had friends with them. Like I've never agreed with their lifestyle, but I love them as people. And it's always been a very difficult thing of how much do we challenge it versus supporting the people, trying not to alienate, but still influence. Like how would you, let's first talk from a ministerial point of view and talk to, ministry leaders out there. How do we respond to events like this?
Well, it's difficult. Let me say that. There's no doubt about it. It really is difficult. But as a matter of fact, I actually preached 2 or 3 sermons on this very topic a few months ago now. And I titled that series, How to Pray Against the Great Awakening, which was a reference to this kind of thing. And I do recall I really enjoyed reading some of the imprecatory psalms. They're called imprecatory psalms because they're calling on God to do nasty things to our enemies. But I also pointed out that actually that's not the New Testament way. And there are various ways in which we can pray against this kind of thing. And my personal belief is that the most important and powerful thing that we can do is to pray for righteousness to, again, take hold of our nation, to take hold of our political leaders, our business leaders, and even some of our church leaders, because we see some woke ideas infiltrating the church as well. So look, our primary response, I think, has to be to get on our knees and pray.
Mm-hmm.
However, I would also say this, as citizens, in my case, of Australia, those of us who are Christians have the same right as everybody else to have a voice in the public square.
Mm.
And one of the most worrying aspects of all this is not so much the flaunting and the going against biblical principles for sure. But it's the fact that this is part of a long process now of actually shutting down any voices of dissent. And it's not just Christians. There are other religious traditions as well that uphold the importance of the traditional family as the cornerstone, the building block of societies. So it's not just Christians. And then, of course, there are many who are conservative, but not necessarily Christian as well. So everybody who holds a dissenting view is being closed down in the public square. I think that is a terrible thing. And I just hope that even people like me find the courage in Christ to be able to take their place in the public square as opportunities become available. This is one such opportunity. And I think it would be wrong for me to shrink back and say, look, that's all okay. On the other hand, we do also need to recognise, of course, that by and large, the prophets, as recorded in the Old Testament, and Jesus, and then the writers of the epistles like Paul and so on, they primarily addressed issues that were going on within the church. And so I think that's something else we need to keep in mind as well, that we do need to be fairly careful that we don't undermine the great commandments to love God, to love our neighbour, that is other people, as we love ourselves, and that we don't also undermine the Great Commission. Go into all the world, and that doesn't just mean countries, that means groups, people holding different worldviews and so on, and make disciples of them. I think there's a real tension there. On the one hand, I find it grossly offensive because I am a classical Christian. I hold to historical Christianity. So I find things like that personally, they're offensive. I would like to get angry like the psalmists and pray some of those imprecatory prayers, but I really don't think we're called to do that as Christians. We're definitely called to pray against the behaviours, not against the people. We're to pray for their salvation. We're to pray for high standards of righteousness among our leaders. And if we're leaders ourselves, let's model high standards of righteousness in every area of our lives.
Yeah, this actually makes me think about trying to think about where I heard this from, but it was one of my mentors shared this with me when I was kind of talking about a topic similar to this with them, and they actually shared with me, like, just remember, people have different values, people have different standards. What they are doing against their own standards is not wrong to them. And so we can't force our standards on just because we see it as wrong in our beliefs. It doesn't mean, how do I say this without trying not to say this without permitting it, but just because we hold ourselves to a certain standard doesn't mean other people have to hold themselves to our standard. We can't judge other people by our own standards. We can only judge ourselves by our own standards. Now, in our beliefs as you said, contemporary Christians, we believe those things are wrong. They don't. In their beliefs, they don't. That's okay. That's their beliefs. Just like we don't want them to force their beliefs onto us, we're not going to force our beliefs onto them. So we can't look at them condemningly because they're not doing something for themselves that they consider wrong, if that makes sense, right? But like you said, we can pray for them that they get a revelation around it, but you can't get upset with someone for doing something wrong that they don't believe they're doing wrong.
Well, there are limits to that, though, because If they thought it was okay to murder somebody, I'm sure that we'd have plenty to say about that, and we would expect the law to uphold certain standards. So I think you've got to be very careful that you don't take that argument too far. But I do think you've made a very good point, and that is that we can't expect them to actually understand where we're coming from, nor can we expect them to act. This is what's happening as conservative voices all over the West are being cancelled or shut down or being denied an opportunity. Look, we see it in politics. There's furor going on in Scotland at the moment over leadership of the Scottish Nationalist Party, because one of the candidates is someone who holds to classical or historical, that is biblical Christianity, and who believes and has stated clearly that she supports traditional marriage, that is marriage as being between a man and a woman by sex, a man who is sexually a man, a woman who is sexually a woman, to the exclusion of all others and for life. And she's being pilloried even by those in her own parties. And it looks increasingly that she won't get a look in at becoming the leader, despite the fact that she's articulate, she's young, she's energetic. She could obviously do a lot of very good things for Scotland, but because she holds a traditional view of marriage and family, she's being shut down. There's a similar example here in Australia of a newly elected member of the Victorian State Parliament who voiced somewhat similar views in her maiden speech. And she's been virtually, she's been pilloried not only by the premier there in that state, but also by her own party, which is supposedly a conservative party, but clearly isn't. So it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough.
Look, I want to go back to that murder statement that you just said. Look, obviously I wouldn't take it that far, and you can't, because what I was saying is within their standards, if they're living within a community that sees that murder is wrong, that should be part of their standards, So we obviously there's legal binding thing, but I'm just talking more on the moral grounds. We can't expect someone to live to moral values that they don't believe in, which kind of leads us into not the next topic, but kind of like the next point in this thing is, which I actually, when I first saw it, I thought it was something else. Because you're talking about we need to have a voice, right? Yes, they are doing their bit to try to silence us and to force us down. But we've got to find as leaders, and this is the thing, as leaders in ministry, as leaders in the marketplace, in businesses, in our families, in society, we actually need to stand up. We need to stand up for our values. Now, it doesn't mean we go against, we just need to stand up for, like Dr. Rod said earlier, we need to have the voice in the local town, in town square, right? We can't be silenced. We need to stand up. Lydia Thorpe, a rogue, now independent, was Green member of Parliament. When I first saw this, she laid down in front of one of the Mardi Gras floats to try to stop the Mardi Gras parade. And at first I thought, the reason why I kind of originally tagged this as something for us to discuss was because I thought she was protesting the Mardi Gras, but she was actually a participant and is actually a supporter of the gay and lesbian, she said dark-skinned people and like for using her terminology, going back, back years of their discrimination and everything like that. And I mean, I don't even know what she was doing, but I suppose what originally brought my attention to it is like, oh, she's protesting the Mardi Gras. When you talk about having that voice in the town square and making sure we stand up for ourselves and make sure we don't get taken over, that's not the right way to do it, is it? To go and lay down in front, like should we be going and kind of attacking their things that they do, or like how should we as leaders stand up for our rights?
Well, I don't know that I'd use her as a good example of how to advance your particular point of view. But look, she does have, in my opinion, a right to her view. And she left the Greens Party because she says she didn't feel free to fight for those things that she really wants to fight for. And she's got a particular agenda in terms of the degree of influence that so-called First Nations people should have over political decision-making and so on. And it's far more radical than the Green Party would probably ever agree to. So, good on her for acting on the basis of her conviction. But whether or not what she did was the right thing to do, I think, is a moot point. And as a couple of conservative commentators have already commented, what if it was somebody who was, in fact, protesting against the whole Mardi Gras and World Pride and so on? I'm fairly certain they would have been arrested.
Yes.
Now, why wasn't the same standard applied to her because of what she did to disrupt the parade? My understanding is she was just given a warning and asked to desist, which I think obviously she did. But, if it had been a prominent person from the conservative side of political thinking in Australia, or a prominent religious leader from one of the main religions in Australia, not necessarily Christian, but if it had been one of them, I think they might have been looking for a good lawyer. So, it exposes the incredible double standards that apply. But look, I do believe that even though I disagree very strongly with nearly everything that she stands for, she must have the right to expression in the public square. But so must we, and I think that's a really important point to make.
But do you feel like we need to go to that extent, or like that, because that's the thing, like, we're seeing all this stuff and we're seeing people clashing and we're seeing protests and everything like that. I understand that protests have their place, like, but we as leaders, what can we do before it gets to that, before inciting violence or going and disrupting someone else's event? What do you suggest we do?
I think we should rely mostly on the power of words. Within the Christian framework, of course, we talk about apologetics, and that the Greek word apologia, of course, means to have an argument. And I think ultimately words win. Words win. If you look through the overarching play of history over the last few thousand years, I think it's actually words, good, solid arguments that win the day. Yeah. There is a Christian apologist by the name of Greg Kokel, who's based in the United States, and one of his major arguments in favour of Christianity is that it is the best explanation of reality. And of course, he goes into great detail about what that means, but I think he's right, and I think it's words that will ultimately win. And so leaders who feel really strongly, and look, I also think it's very important for those of us who are Christians that we check in with God. And because if I saw a Christian do that, my initial reaction would not be to condemn them or to say they're an extremist and they've gone too far, but I would simply want to know, is this what you believe God has called you to do? Yeah. And many people, certainly in Australia, will recall the Israel Folau case, which I think we have spoken about once or twice and a couple of times in passing. Many people said, well, what he did, it was a bit silly. He made these statements on social media. But for me, my issue was, well, did God tell you to do that? And he has actually addressed that issue and says, yes, I believe God told me to do that. And I think that is the most important thing.
100%. Yeah.
So my reaction isn't initially to condemn or to support, but I always would like to know, well, you know what, is this something, because God may well call some people to do things that others might see as being a bit outrageous. And there are biblical precedents, of course.
That's good. That's good. I actually feel like I could speak about this forever because there's a couple other things that I want to talk about with this. I'm just concentrating on time, but let's talk about it, because I remember like the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras happened like a couple of streets away from where I used to live in Sydney, and I remember around that time of year, it was just, the place was plastered with rainbows and everything like that, which actually I think it's kind of funny because whenever I see one of those rainbow flags, I just think about the rainbow over the ark and the promise that God gave us,
Yeah,
you know, like
absolutely.
it's funny that they seem to have claimed it, but I just remind myself that, you know what, that's our promise from God, that
You
no
bet it
matter
is.
how wicked the world gets, he still loves everyone, and he's never gonna do something like that again. So yeah, maybe there's a bit of a side point there, but there's so many businesses that just get wrapped up in it, and Coles had their own float, and Google had their own float, and there's a bunch of big corporations that they had their own floats there and everything like that, which kind of lends itself to being, is it just a big corporate thing? It's all government funded, and there's a whole nother. I don't even want to get into that, but we spoke about ministry leaders, but what about business leaders? How do we, if we are Christians leading an organization, or even if we're not Christians, if we have certain values that don't agree with that, how do we stand up to the pressure from our own staff, from our clients, from our suppliers, from whatever, to get involved and show our support for this? And if we don't show our support, that means we're against it, and we're haters, and we're right-winged, racists, and whatever. Like, what should we do as business leaders to stand firm in our values against representing these sorts of things or being caught up?
Again, Craig, look, I think this is a really, really difficult area. And in Australia and in other countries in the West, I'm primarily talking about the West, there are Christians in high positions within the business world who have actually lost their jobs because of their Christian faith.
Yeah.
And there have been some quite high-profile cases. For me, it's a really difficult issue because I don't want to say that big business and corporations shouldn't get involved in social issues. For example, a few years ago, there was involvement of some prominent business people in the whole area of dealing with modern slavery. And in the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, Australia, and many other countries, that eventually led to legislation that required large businesses to do supply chain audits and sort of cut out any areas in which there was modern slavery, because there's modern slavery everywhere, including in Australia.
Yeah.
Now, I saw that was a good thing. I don't agree with what's happening in a lot of large businesses now, where they are so openly supporting what I disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit reluctant to say they shouldn't, because if I say, well, they shouldn't get involved in social issues, then that also means they shouldn't get involved in social issues that I would actually support. So that sort of addresses, I think, half of your question. It's a terribly difficult thing.
I actually think that you do answer it in a roundabout way that actually gives a good point of, like, have something that you maybe this is the call to action, is make sure you as an organization have something that you are supporting and that you are standing for, that when these other needs or other like cultural things come up, you can go, yeah, that's fine. I'm called to stand up for this thing, right? And this is what we support, and this is what we as an organization, we get behind this wholly and solely. And maybe that's a bit of a nicer defense to something like that, is just, as long as we know whether we are doing some social action, I suppose you could say, like you said, that gives us a little bit better of a leg to stand on, rather than, goes that saying of like, make sure we're known for what we stand for, not what we stand against.
Yeah, look, even that worries me, because a lot of the world thinks, well, all Christians are just against homosexuality and abortion and euthanasia. Well, one of the reasons for that's all that the press reports. They don't report on all the good things that communities of faith, including Christian communities, actually do. It's not newsworthy. You don't get thrown in jail for doing the good things, You get hauled before a Human Rights Commission because you dare to open your mouth and say something that might be taken as offence by another person. So it's very difficult. But I think, the other half of your question was about what do we do as individuals, and I know I sound like a cracked record, but look, you've got to know what God wants you to do.
Yeah.
And look, I respect leaders in business in high positions who are not coming out and making public statements against what you might loosely call, what the woke agenda. By the same token, I have a lot of admiration for those who do, often ultimately at the cost of their job. I really do think the key is you've got to know that you're hearing from God. Those of us who hold to classical or historical Christianity, we've got a pretty strong view on what is right and wrong in terms of how we express our sexuality and our sexual desires. And it seems that, frankly, most of the world couldn't care less. And then there's a small proportion, 2 or 3%, who care very, very deeply about it. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important for us. We got to know what the Bible has to say, because in my view, the Bible is the final arbiter on all matters concerning Christian faith and practice. But when we're actually in the middle of a situation as a leader, as a senior manager in a business, we've got to know, is God saying to us, now is the time for you to stand up? God might not be telling you to stand up now because he's saving you up for a more important occasion. In other words, God will use us strategically to fight battles, and we've just really we have to understand that as leaders, as managers in businesses and so on, we're partnering with God. When we're not actually doing the leading, he's doing the leading.
That's great. Yeah, look, let's just stand strong. Make sure we know what we stand for. Make sure you know what God is calling you to, because you're absolutely right, Dr. Rod, that we aren't called, not all of us are called to speak out against every situation. And like you say, maybe God is creating us as a sleeper agent that is going to activate, sometime in the future, at a prime future, when you have maybe even more influence and it's a bigger impact that God has actually called you for. So make sure you stay close to knowing what God's called you to, and when he's calling you to it as well. I think that's really wise words. Once again, and also a bit of a shameless plug about our free leadership program, where we start out the first 10 weeks by figuring out, what is your calling? What are you called for? What is your purpose? What is your mandate from heaven? Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it challenged your leadership or inspired you in some way, put a comment below. And if you want to watch the full episode or more content like this, check out our channel. And hey, consider subscribing while you're there.